some of the feedback that we got on Twitter is that it's not ambitious enough.
Yeah. They want to make Ethereum ambitious again.
How do we prevent commoditizing what we've ossified?
And then the builders just like polished it a little bit around the edges.
Like Max Resnick are saying we should be aiming for 1 second.
Okay, yeah. So there's a lot to unpack here.
Welcome in from Thailand, from Bangkok, here today with Justin Drake, just a couple short hours after his presentation about Beamchain. Justin, welcome in, and how are you feeling after your presentation?
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. Yes, I was really hyped up for the presentation yesterday. I've worked really hard to try and get some sort of a proposal that people feel comfortable internally within the researchers and the devs. And the room was absolutely fully packed, and people couldn't come in. I was told there were hundreds of people who couldn't come in, who had to watch it online. A lot of people have sent me, personal messages saying that they're very excited. We now have new Beam team clients. So in addition to the Zeem client and to the Lambda class client, we have the Nevermind folks, for example, who are interested. And a bunch of people sent me emails to beam.chain@ethereum.org. All sorts of skill sets, some researchers, some developers, some networking people. And so now really what I want to do is let the dust settle and incorporate as much feedback as I can in the proposal. Because ultimately this is just a proposal. This is the beginning of a potential accelerationist journey for the Ethereum roadmap. And some of the feedback that we got on Twitter is that it's not ambitious enough.
Yeah. They want to make Ethereum ambitious again.
Which is kind of crazy because what I'm suggesting for the specific subset of the roadmap is extremely ambitious. But I think maybe what we need to do is zoom out and look at the big picture. Because people want things to change now, like next year or this year even. And I think there are things to look forward to that will be shipped incrementally in addition to what I'm proposing, which is this big fork, which would happen in 4 years or so.
Yeah, I think that incremental hard fork would only get us so far, and that's sort of what the timeline and the roadmap is set out to be right now. Yeah. And so for people that are claiming that it's not ambitious enough, this is actually chunking up a lot of that roadmap and going at it in one shot. And that's quite ambitious, at least more ambitious than the current roadmap.
Yeah, so when you look at the Ethereum layer 1, it has 3 sublayers. It has the consensus sublayer, the data sublayer with dank sharding, and it has the execution sublayer with the EVM. Now, I think basically part of the confusion was that I only focused on the consensus layer, which is in some sense the most conservative and slow and ambitious part of the roadmap. But there's going to be gains happening at the data layer and the execution layer relatively soon. So for example, at the data layer, right, the mandate is basically to ship full dank sharding as quickly as possible. And we're going to incrementally get there with steps like PeerDAS and basically increase the number of blobs. And my personal extremely bullish take is that we're going to go way above and beyond what full dank sharding is advertised as. And the reason is that internet bandwidth just grows over time, 50% per year. That's Nielsen's law. And we're not going to get 128 or 256 blobs. I think we're going to get 1,024 blobs per slot eventually. But yeah, it's going to be a whole progression over the years. And then at the execution layer, one of the things that I'm extremely excited about, and I think the community is also getting really excited about, is this notion of snarkifying the EVM, having ZK VMs, and ultimately having native rollups. And the amazing thing that we have right now is a very vibrant ecosystem of ZK VMs. This is something I highlighted in my talk. We have maybe 10 or so ZK VMs. The vast majority, 7 of them, are RISC-V ZK VMs, but there's also non-RISC-V ZK VMs. There's like MIPS, there's Cairo, and there's all sorts of others like Valida. And ultimately what's going to happen, in my opinion, is that next year, by the end of next year, we're going to have the L1 EVM fully snarkified.
Really?
So what does that mean? It means that for every single block, we're going to have a proof which is going to be generated by some subset of these vendors. And one piece of alpha here is that the Ethereum Foundation has been working for several months on a new website. ETHproofs.org is not live yet, but I think it's worth sharing. The basic idea is to have a block explorer for EVM proofs, so that every single slot you have a block, and then you would have all of the proofs of validity from all of the various vendors. So we're partnering with RISC-V and SP1 kind of as launch partners for this website. And the idea is that for every single proof that's generated, we have metadata, like how many seconds it took to generate the proof, and two, how many cents did it take to generate the proof. And what I think will happen is that many of the vendors, purely as a marketing expense, will be willing to, snarkify the whole of the L1 just to be on the website and compete on the leaderboard.
That is some alpha. And one thing that Vitalik said in his cryptography panel yesterday was that he thinks that the terminology of zero knowledge and snarks is going to slowly just kind of fade away, and we'll just stick to the word proof. While there are technological implementation details that are important to understand between the types of zero knowledge proofs, this also kind of overlays into this broader new site and new data dashboard.
Right, so to a very large extent, the word ZK has lost its original meaning of zero knowledge. It's the royal ZK, which basically stands for all of advanced cryptography that we are consuming and accelerating within the context of Ethereum. And to a very large extent, that's going to be snarks, which is basically just proofs. But the memetics of ZK are pretty strong. It's like a very short term, and I think it's okay if we just change the meaning and have this understanding as just a royal ZK, and we'll see what sticks. People have tried to change, for example, ZK rollups to validity rollups, and that hasn't really worked out. I mean, proof rollups doesn't sound too good. So I'm still personally bullish on the memetics of ZK, but of course I agree with Vitalik that ultimately it's about fancy cryptography, which ultimately itself is about proving statements.
And the EF has invested quite a bit into ZK, and this entire ecosystem has invested quite a bit into ZK. And
100%, yes.
Yeah, and this is part of this larger, bigger picture shift. And you laid this out in your presentation, from proof of work to proof of stake, and then now into ZK. And so kind of walk us through this evolution of Ethereum. This is what, and you mentioned memetics, and people are calling this Ethereum 3.0, so kind of walk us through the memetics of this.
That was David Huffman right there. That was his question.
Right. So I do want to kind of linger a little bit on all of the investments that we've made, because I want to highlight a few things.
Yeah.
One is that we've recently started a $20 million formal verification program.
We did a podcast with Alexander Hicks and walked all the way through this.
That was a great episode. Go listen to it. And basically, this is closely tied to the ZK VM story. And there's going to be a lot of formal verification of the RISC-V circuits, for example, that are being done. Another thing that I want to emphasize is that a very large portion of the Ethereum Foundation is basically this team called PSE. It has an extremely large, it's the largest team in all of the Ethereum Foundation.
What does PSE stand for?
It stands for Privacy and Scaling Explorations.
Okay.
So it's basically snarks, the privacy part of snarks and the scaling part of snarks. And they've gone down all sorts of directions, and they themselves have a ZK VM team within PSE, and they were one of the pioneers that started to snarkify the EVM way back when we didn't even have this new direction of ZK VMs. And again, like there's this ETH-proof website that will go and accelerate the snark proving. The good news is that I think we can release the pedal a little bit on accelerating it, because the whole ecosystem is funding it. There's these companies probably have combined hundreds of millions of dollars of VC funding. I mean, I just checked this morning, SP1 received, so Succinct, the company behind SP1, received $55 million in one of their latest rounds. So this is amazing accelerationism. I think what we need to focus on, at the Ethereum Foundation is maybe things like standardization, public goods like standardization and formal verification, because those teams want to ship as fast as possible. They want to be number one. And, security sometimes might be a lagging thing relative to actually shipping. Now, to your actual question around, this transition from proof of work to proof of stake to ZK, It's a little bit of an exaggeration in the sense that it's still proof of stake,
Okay.
but it's kind of proof of stake plus plus, where we make use of this really powerful technology, which is snarks. And the idea is to make use of it in a couple places. Place number one is to snarkify the entirety of Ethereum. Let's snarkify it all. And that includes snarkifying the consensus layer and the EVM. So what does that give us? It gives us several things. The first thing is that any entity that is consuming the Ethereum chain can do so with extremely low resources. Think a mobile phone or a smartwatch. Basically, you're just verifying a single proof, and that allows you to sync to the tip of the chain and to know that this is a valid chain. So if you're a user, for example, using MetaMask, right now you're trusting in Throughput to tell you what is the state of the chain. You won't have to do that in the future. If you want to build, if you're consuming the Ethereum chain, for example, from a smart contract in another L1, and you want to build these trustless bridges, then again, you can make use of that. If you're a validator, you need to be synced up at the tip of the chain. And basically the vision is that the validators can just run on their smartwatches in the future. So we're dramatically lowering the barrier to entry to becoming a solo validator.
Yeah.
And then the final amazing thing about snarkifying things is that we can enshrine the snarkification of Ethereum within itself. Okay, that sounds a little crazy.
That sounds interesting.
Can we have the smooth brain explanation here?
The smooth brain explanation is that there's going to be a ZK VM precompile. So that if you want to launch a ZK rollup within Ethereum, it's a one line of code. Right? So there's this notion of programmable execution sharding. So previously, way back when, 5 years ago, in the roadmap, we had execution sharding. What is that? It's basically 64 or 1024 copies of the EVM, exact copies, and they would each have their notion of state, and they would each kind of grow asynchronously relative to each other. Now we have a so much better roadmap, and it's basically synchronous, programmable execution sharding. So let me go through like all of the terms. The first one, which is maybe the most important, is programmable. So instead of being limited to just 64 or 1024 shards, programmers around the world can just deploy as many copies of the EVM as they want. So that is horizontal scaling of the L1 EVM. And for them, not only do they have the convenience of just having one single line of code to deploy an EVM ZK rollup, but they can also have the privilege of not having any bugs. They don't have to worry about that. And they don't have to worry about governance whenever the EVM changes. Right, because the EVM is a living being. There's new opcodes that are added, or the gas schedule changes, and all of those changes will be immediately reflected in this precompile. Another amazing thing about the ZK EVM precompile is that the gas limit can be set arbitrarily high, and the reason is that the validators that would be verifying the state transition functions within the EVM, they only have to verify snarks. And those, it's a constant amount of time. It takes, say, 1 millisecond to verify an arbitrarily large amount of state transitions. And so what I expect will happen is that we can take what is currently the 30 million gas limit on L1 and increase that, maybe 10x, maybe 100x. But then the programmable shards can just go completely crazy and remove the gas limit entirely.
On our last podcast, we talked about base, the L2, and we talked about how the relationship between MEV and contention fees versus their congestion fees.
Yes.
And there was a lot of back and forth, but basically we came to the conclusion that the reason they don't have much fees due to congestion is because they just keep raising their gas limit.
Yes.
And that's why 80% of their fees come from MEV and contention.
Yes.
And so now we're going to raise the gas limit and kind of remove the need for congestion on the EVM. Is that the right way to think about this?
So one mental model is that previously the bottleneck was on the validator side of things. The validators are kind of assumed to be very weak. They're like Raspberry Pis on home internet connections, and there's only so much they can do. But with snarks, we're basically removing this bottleneck on the validator side of things. And now the bottleneck is going to be on the builder and prover side of things. So unfortunately, you take any virtual machine, just because of the laws of physics, it can only process so many transactions per second. We're going to max out the number of transactions per second. I think what is this project that is trying to go to 100,000 transactions per second? Mega Eve.
Yeah.
Mega Eve.
And Rise and
Yeah.
some of these others
Some
as
of
well.
Yeah, so there's a lot of projects out there that are really trying to push the number of transactions. And let's say that the ultimate is like 1 million transactions per second.
Okay.
Then what's going to happen is that the effective gas limit is going to be dictated by the laws of physics, and then now we're going to create a fee market within that context. And ultimately it's going to be the builders and the provers that are going to have to deal with maybe large amount of state or large amount of computation.
Yeah, and I think in addition to the broader consensus L1 changes that are impacted from Snarkification, it also is very applicable to L2s, which kind of ties into another aspect of Beam, which is faster finality, effectively, and kind of improving the L1 from that perspective. And one kind of core issue for L2s right now is interoperability between L2s is very problematic from a perspective of security, because the only way to do it completely verifiably is to wait for the L1 for a block to be confirmed and then eventually finalized, which takes 12 seconds and then 12 to 18 minutes. So how does this snarkification of the L1 in combination with the kind of further rhetoric of improving the finality, how does that kind of all tie together to build this broader, more stronger rollup-centric future?
Right, so one of the issues is that the L2s today basically are using the L1 as a mechanism to force include transactions. And basically one of the worst cases for them is that the L1 kind of tells them to force include some transactions, and then they force include them, and then the L1 rugs them and reorgs and tells them to force include different transactions that are inconsistent. And so now the L2 itself, which thought that it had finalized, can't finalize. And so what happens in practice is that the chains will just wait for enough confirmation or even finality before they're comfortable processing the forced transactions. And single slot finality basically dramatically reduces that. Now, one of the things that I want to emphasize is single slot finality is a little bit of a misnomer. And the reason is that from a throughput standpoint, yes, every single block you finalize, every single slot you're finalizing a new block. So the throughput is 1 block per slot, but the latency is actually 3 slots. And the reason is that fundamentally the process of achieving finality is kind of a couple rounds of interaction.
Right.
And so, there will still be like this little tip of the chain which won't be finalized. Now, one of the things that I'm a proponent of is this notion of base rollups, where basically you're synchronizing the forced inclusion and the default sequencing mechanism. So if one reorgs, the other automatically reorgs and everything stays safe. So this is one potential path forward to solve this problem of the L1 reorging and all of the complications with the forced inclusion logic.
Got it. One of the things that we're talking about here is snarkification, and then there is this movement to enshrine these elements into the L1. Kind of part of the rollup-centric roadmap was to actually push a lot of that into L2 and not do a lot of enshrining. And so what has been the philosophy as to like what to enshrine and then what to push off into the L2s?
Yeah, so the ultimate philosophy of Ethereum, I think, is you want to be maximally simple and still provide the basic building blocks that people can program around. Mm-hmm. And so I think the move from execution sharding to programmable execution sharding is very much in that direction. I mean, the programmability allows for these rollups to have custom sequences and governance tokens and fee tokens and all of the infrastructure around it. Ultimately, the virtual machine is just a piece of technology that will get commoditized. Now, we can actually go one level further, and this is something that I'm really excited about, which is to boost the programmability by not enshrining the EVM itself, but enshrining a ZK VM underneath it, and specifically RISC-V. So you could imagine that instead of having a ZK EVM precompile, we have a ZK RISC-V precompile. And the idea here is that the EVM would just be basically a RISC-V program, bytecode, that would be interpreted in real time by the actual native virtual machine, which would be RISC-V. And RISC-V is much, much more lower level. You can think of it as being a CPU, and actually it is manufactured as a CPU in various computers today. And one of the really kind of cool things about using RISC-V as the underlying virtual machine that we would enshrine is that there will be no more bike shedding around the gas schedule. And the reason is that we could just have one gas be one cycle of a RISC-V CPU.
Got it. Okay, so now that so in this practical world that we start to implement Beamchain, or at least like the specs that you have laid out, one of the core ones was the reduction of the slot time and as well as single slot finality. How did you get to the mental model of, okay, rather than the current 12-second block time, we should basically divide this by 3, get to 4-second block times, three of these in one block per se. How does that, like, why did you come to that exact like figure? Because a lot of other folks in the Ethereum community, or at least some prominent ones, like Max Resnick, are saying we should be aiming for 1 second block times.
Yeah. Okay, so there's many different thoughts that I have here.
Okay.
The first one is that I think a lot of, to a large extent, the L1 slot time is not as important as people spin it out to be. People like Max Resnick, for example.
Okay.
And part of the reason is that we have notions called pre-confirmations, right? And this is starting to become the de facto standard. We have Arbitrum that has 250 millisecond pre-confirmations. We have the superchain that has two seconds pre-confirmation, and even base rollups are getting pre-confirmations. And ultimately, I think the end game for pre-confirmations is 0 milliseconds. So the slot time is basically 0, and or we call it 1 millisecond, let's say. And then from the perspective of the user, the only latency is 1 ping time.
Okay.
Right, it's the time it takes to reach the sequencer and back, and that is optimal. So with pre-confirmations, I think to a very large extent, the problem of long slot times moves away. But for base pre-confirmations specifically, there is this one problem, which is that some percentage of the time, it might be 0.1%, or it might be 1%, or it might be 5%, I don't know. Like the validator might be offline or whatever it is, and then basically pre-confirmations skip a beat. So for a whole slot, you don't have pre-confirmations, and that is a bad UX. I mean, arguably, this is something that we experience on the internet every day. I'm traveling around Bangkok, and then sometimes the internet connection is not so great, and it takes 4 seconds to load my web page, and my life goes on, and it's fine. But most of the time, let's say 95% of the time, it just loads within 100 milliseconds. So I think that's one consideration. And basically, reducing the slot time down to 4 seconds is really just about reducing this worst case thing that would only happen like a small percentage of the time. Now, to answer your actual question about why 4 seconds as opposed to 12 seconds, well, basically what happened historically is that 12 seconds was picked to be extremely conservative. It was picked to be very close, for example, to the previous slot time, which was 13 seconds. So we wouldn't necessarily be accelerating the EVM that much more. But what needs to happen in a single slot is basically a round of attestations. What does that mean? It means that some subset of the validators need to make signatures. These signatures need to be gossiped, and then they need to be aggregated and included on-chain. And what we realized is that, with the constraints of Ethereum, we can probably safely bring the slot time down to 4 seconds. Now, the important thing here is with the constraints of Ethereum, right? Ethereum is a very unique project that is trying to be extremely secure, extremely credibly neutral, and extremely robust. And two of the big requirements that we have are, number one, if you have a home internet connection with high latency in Australia, then you should still be able to participate, right? And then the other big constraint is that we want to have extremely high amounts of validators and economic security, and we want to be aggregating, tens of thousands of signatures per slot. And this is an extremely ambitious thing to do from an engineering perspective, right? Imagine taking tens of thousands of messages that get gossiped around, aggregating all of that in just a matter of seconds. So one of the things that I actually want to de-risk at the very beginning of kind of this journey is precisely that. How can we aggregate all of these attestations as quickly as possible? Because ultimately, what is consensus? It's just a fancy mechanism to count votes.
One of the things that you mentioned in your presentation, and also Vitalik mentioned in sort of these possibilities of the Ethereum roadmap and the merge, is a tester-proposer separation.
Yeah.
And so kind of, you're mentioning aggregating a bunch of signatures together and like kind of attesting to that that's what happens when we produce blocks. Like, how does that mechanism change in a tester-proposer separation?
So it doesn't change. It's kind of, when you're a validator today, you have two different roles. Role number one is that you're an attester, which is that you're basically voting on the tip of the chain on a regular basis. And then there's a completely different role, which is called proposing, where you basically propose a new block on chain. A tester-proposer separation, as the name suggests, is that it's basically completely decoupling these two roles. Instead of being bundled as the role of the validator, they're unbundled. And instead, basically, the expectation is that the validators are only doing the attesting, and the proposing comes from the wider market. So basically, there is an auction, which is actually, in some sense, more permissionless than it currently is, because you don't even have to have stake. Anyone around the world, including the validators, but also including anyone else, can just participate in the auction to try and win the right to propose the next block.
So right now, validators are doing both. But
Yes.
in a tester-proposer separation, validators would only be doing the attesting.
Yeah.
Proposers would be this permissionless auction mechanism.
Yes. And just to be clear, like, the role of proposing right now, to a very large extent, is just signing a header blindly that you receive from a relay, or that ultimately came from a builder. So like 99% of the effort is kind of away from the validators, and what APS is all about is just taking this 1% and like very cleanly putting it away. And if you do that, you clean up a lot. You remove timing games as a concern for the validators. You remove MEV spikes. You remove worries about pre-confirmations and sophistication and having to deposit collateral. And so ultimately, I think it's a very healthy thing that can make the validator set extremely unsophisticated. And ultimately, the end game is that you're just a dumb validator on a smartwatch in your home internet connection, and that's enough. Now, one of the worries, that keeps creeping up, and I think it, to a large extent, it's unwarranted, but that is a discussion to be had, is that people think that this is going to be really, really bad for block building because it's going to be like hyper centralized. Now, the framing that I have is that the validators would still be responsible for the most critical part of block building, which is including transactions on chain, censorship resistance. And the proposal that we have is called inclusion list, specifically fossil. So the IL in fossil stands for inclusion list. And the idea here is that at every single slot, you have 16 validators that basically build lists of transactions that they've seen. And then these lists get aggregated into one master list. And then that is the starting point for the builders to go build their block. Now, what I imagine will happen is that the vast majority of transactions will be in the inclusion list. And ultimately, what the builders will do is just like polish the list a little bit. And there's two ways in which they can polish it. One is that they can reorder the transactions. And two, they can insert transactions here and there. And what they would likely do is, at the very least, include one transaction at the very top and one transaction at the very bottom for the front running and back running. And so what will happen, in my opinion, is that Ethereum would be like extremely healthy and have decentralized block building from an inclusion standpoint. But then, like, the very final piece that is done by the builders would be centralized. And the one mental model that I have here is this notion of raw material and polishing. So you can imagine that the validators provide the raw material to build the blocks, and then the builders just like polish it a little bit around the edges.
Safe is moving the world's GDP on-chain. With the introduction of SafeNet, Safe is taking this to the next step very soon. Check out net.safe.global to learn more about how Safe is moving the world's GDP on-chain.
Welcome aboard on our journey into the singularity. This is the endgame roadmap for Frax and Fraxtal, the new L2 out of the Frax ecosystem that is totally based on fractal scaling. Fractal is a modular L2 blockchain built by Frax with modular and fractal scaling in mind. Fractal scaling is based on the Mandelbrot set of fractal images, and it explains how L2s become L3s and the entire app chain lifecycle goes through its evolution. The Frax ecosystem is made of some of the top builders in the space and has stemmed from its OG days of the Frax stablecoin. It is now in the LST space, the LRT space, and this Fractal L2 joins the existing suite of Frax products, including Frax Swap and Frax Lend. You can see Frax Ferry, the bridge to go from any chain, Arbitrum, Optimism, or mainnet into the Fractal mainnet. Bridge your tokens and bring your Frax assets into the Fractal ecosystem. Join today to get the best out of Fractal. You are still early. Join today. Take part in our expedition into the singularity.
Redstone modular oracles are available on 50 plus chains, trusted by over 100 clients and over 6 billion in total value secured. Visit redstone.finance to find out more. Yeah, I mean, this is part of this, like, I think there's really, people want inclusion lists. Fossil is a proposal.
100%.
People want execution auctions. People want Orbit. Like, we want all of these things that are part of the Beamchain proposal.
Yeah.
The main pushback here is faster. Do it faster. We want it now.
Faster, faster, faster. Yes.
I mean, everybody in crypto has like the mentality of like the rat that has like that gets the peanut butter and then wants it again. I mean, so but part of that though is this ossification accelerationism.
Yes.
Like, because like,
can you pill us on ossification accelerationism?
Yeah, like how are you balancing this idea of Ethereum as this like immutable, credibly neutral, extremely decentralized base layer versus okay, we need to make these changes to the base layer and like, you know, is this the end game for Ethereum, or like how do you balance ossification versus like we need to improve the L1?
And speed and safety, because people want it now, but they don't want it to break Ethereum. And so to accelerate ossification, I think it's to do it quickly, but you can't we don't want to sacrifice the safety of the system.
Okay, yeah. So there's a lot to unpack here. So one of my kind of mental models for ossification is that there's two types of ossification. There's unhealthy ossification and healthy ossification. The unhealthy sophistication is basically where you're not able to evolve and you have stuff, you know, that you want to do. And the reason why you're not able to evolve is because you're crumbling under your own weight. Right? Like, for example, you're securing so much value that you become so conservative that you paralyze. And then now what you've ossified is kind of this suboptimal design. And, you know, that's going to lead to ultimately like frustration and opportunity for competitor to come in and all sorts of other negative externalities. And then there's basically the healthy ossification, which is you've reached a point which is close enough to optimal. It's good enough. And it means that, you know, you enter this maintenance mode where, you know, you've effectively cleared the whole roadmap, and there isn't this tension where, you know, in the future there is this big re-architecturing that we would want to do. And you know, the reason why people want ossification is because ultimately Ethereum is about providing certainties about the future. We don't want to be like rugging people and changing the APIs and whatnot. And, you know, this is to a large extent why we can't, you know, change the EVM. Right, the EVM needs to be maximally forward compatible, and so already there, you know, it's kind of crazy to think that the EVM would change to something very different, unless, you know, we do this kind of crazy rabbit out of the hat where we go one level down with RISC-V, and then now that allows you to build other virtual machines on top of RISC-V.
Yeah, I mean, like. One thing you mentioned earlier was the commoditization of you know, things like the EVM. So how do we prevent commoditization? Like, once we ossify, right? That's kind of it. We enter maintenance mode. How do we prevent commoditizing what we've ossified?
How do we prevent commoditizing what we have ossified? Well, no, we want commoditization and ossification. These two things are aligned, right? I mean, when you started the question, what came to mind is kind of this mental model that was shared recently, I think, by David on Bankless, which is that there's kind of this decoupling of responsibilities, right? Like in some sense, what the L1 is there to provide is, infrastructure and technology, and what the L2s ultimately are there to provide is BD and new users and things like that. And this is a story which is only starting to happen now, because initially, the big projects like Arbitrum and Optimism and ZK Sync, like these were like technology research shops, right? They raised hundreds of millions of dollars because it takes an army of engineers to go build these fraud-proof games and these snark circuits. But ultimately what's going to happen is that the fraud-proof games and the snark circuits, they're going to commoditize. It's not going to be a differentiator for the rollups. What's going to be the real differentiator is something other than technology, because the technology, whether or not it gets enshrined within Ethereum, and I think it will to a large extent, it's not the differentiator if you're in a world that is commoditized. And so if you look at Base, for example, which was mentioned earlier, like they have an obvious kind of value add, which is to connect all of the millions of users that they have and bring them to Ethereum. If you look at Optimism, for example, they have this really interesting strategy around public goods. And this is the kind of mentality that we need.
Yeah, Justin. So I think one last thing from us, and I don't want to be selfish because we have so many community questions to ask you. The last one is on our podcast that we did several months back. We talked about ETH, the asset, and how you're thinking about the way of long-term value accrual amongst other kind of properties of moneyness and this monetary premium. And one of your core points was around the economy of scale of being this kind of large data availability provider and earning fees long term. If we get into this world of 100 million transactions per second, Ethereum ends up generating billions of dollars a year in fees from data availability. I think you may have to fact check me on the exact
10 million transactions per second.
10 million, sorry. Okay. I was getting a little ambitious. We're going to make Ethereum ambitious again. And so now that you've proposed Beamchain and these really core improvements to the L1 base layer, has your thesis on the Ethereum ETH, the asset, monetary premium or value kind of properties, the mental model of that, has that changed, or is it still the same?
It's still the same.
Okay.
So like my fundamental mental model is that there's two parts to the valuation proposition. The first part is flows, and then the second part is monetary premium. And I say first and second, but actually in some sense the contribution of the monetary premium is much larger than the flows. I think it's roughly a 9-to-1 ratio. So 10% of the value comes from flows, and then 90% comes from monetary premium. And on the topic of flows, I'm still extremely bullish on DA. And the reason is that DA has strong network effects. There's people out there on crypto Twitter that will say, oh, it's commoditized. And that's actually like far, far, far from the truth. And the reason you want to, there's several reasons why this is the case. The first one is that if you want shared security, if you want, undeniably secure money Legos that other people can feel comfortable composing with, then you need to consume Ethereum DA. And so that's already like a huge network effect. And just stepping back in terms of like the availability of DA, right? We're constrained by basically 100 home internet connections. And the reason is that each validator needs to be on a home internet connection. And dank sharding, full dank sharding gives us 100 home internet connections for the whole world. And so, sure, it's 10 million transactions per second, but that is going to be a drop in the bucket in terms of all of the world's activity, transactional activity. Okay, so what are the network effects? Number one, I've already mentioned it, it's shared security. Yep. But then there's another one, which is shared synchrony, synchronous composability. And the reason is that if you go use one of these, commoditized DAs like Celestia, well, guess what? You're now introducing a new sequencer. You now have the Celestia sequencer, which is playing a key role in the production and settlement of these transactions. And so now you can't have synchronous composability because synchronous composability is all about sharing the sequencer. And so now that you have two, it doesn't work anymore. And then there's the final thing that I only realized in the last few months, which is that in order to make use of this magic ZK VM precompile or ZK RISC-V precompile, the data needs to be available, meaning that it needs to be published in the blobs, in the Ethereum blobs. And this is a technical detail whereby in order for the validators to be able to receive these Snark proofs, anyone in the world needs to be able to produce the proofs. But to produce the proofs, you need the data to be available. And so this superpower of having the native rollups only works for rollups. So there's no such thing as a native validium. There's only native rollups.
Got it.
We got community questions?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. And I think Rob and I both share the sentiment that you get a lot of flack from the Ethereum community, from the broader Ethereum space. And I just think that these ideas that you propose, you put yourself out there, and they're ripe for criticism and for questions. So please take some of these with a grain of salt and feel free to answer them as you please. Okay. We'll start with some of the less spicy ones, but maybe this is a difficult one. 2077 Collective is asking, what would it take to accomplish this entire vision in 1 year?
I mean, what I'm hoping will happen is that we can ship the entirety of the Ethereum roadmap this decade, by 2029, by the end of 2029. So we have 5 years. Now, what I've basically done is that I've looked at the big picture, and we have these three different layers: consensus, data, and execution. And I think data and execution are definitely on the path towards completing this 2029 mission. But then the part that's kind of seemed to be changing way too slowly relative to the ambition of the roadmap was the consensus layer. And so this is why I want to accelerate it. Now, to answer the specific question, Ethereum doesn't get anything done in 1 year, right? Like, even if you want to do the simplest of change, you have to go through the whole consensus and governance process, and that takes way more than a year, because it needs to first of all, you need to gain rough consensus within the community, and then you need to go write an EIP, and then you need to write a bunch of tests, and then all of the different clients, and there's 5 of them, either if you are the consensus layer or the execution layer, and then you need to go schedule the fork, and all of that overhead just takes 1 year. And so this is the reality that I've come to accept, that Ethereum ships 1 fork per year. And this is what we've seen since the merge. We've had the merge in 2021, and then we had a fork in 2020. So we had the genesis in 2019, and then we had a fork in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, and we'll have one in 2025. And the thing that I've been, that I want to pour acceleration as fuel on is basically increasing the size of the forks that do happen once a year.
I see, yeah.
And so I think for the next few years, realistically, we can only have these relatively small forks. But if we have this parallel effort to the incremental approach, then maybe in 4 years' time, we can have this mega fork that kind of wipes clean the roadmap and basically closes the gap with research.
As Ethereum is approaching its gigagas era, I think the right term would be a gigafork.
It would be a gigafork, yes. I mean, the other thing that I want to try and highlight is that one of my goals was to try and create, I guess, a Schelling point that the community can be excited around.
Right.
And in some sense, the fact that it's not next year, but it's several years in the future might be an advantage in that context. Mm-hmm. And this is something that I think we've seen, with proof of stake and the merge. There was kind of this build-up of excitement over multiple years, and something for people to be excited about. One of the pieces of feedback that I got from the community is that, we're now in maintenance mode and we're doing all these things. There's nothing to be excited about. Well, now here we have something that is really ambitious, really exciting, and sure, it takes a few years, but that is the price that you have to pay to be in crypto. You have to be a long-term thinker, otherwise, go trade meme coins.
Got it. Okay, so we've got Josh from Mantle. Justin's having a great time. When and what can existing rollups with technical debt do?
So the good news with Rollups is that they have access to governance, and so they have the ability to change, and so technical debt for them is maybe relatively easy to clear, especially if we have this precompile coming in. So if they're an EVM rollup, which is the vast majority of rollups are, then at some point in the future they can just have this one upgrade to just clear like all the thousands of lines of code that they've written for their EVM circuit or EVM fraud proof. So I'm not too worried about the technical debt. What I think the rollup should be thinking about is growth, 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 users, users, users. And yeah, in some, I mean, one of the things that that Vitalik shared at one point in one of the Telegram groups is that you know the L1 is competing with Bitcoin and the L2s are competing with Solana, right? So there's this notion that you know Ethereum is only interested in infrastructure and there's no apps and users, but you know that is the remit of the L1 because the users of the L1 are developers, and then the user of the users is retail. Mm-hmm. There's this level of indirection, and I think it's we should kind of embrace this separation of concerns. And you know, the L1 should focus on infrastructure, and the L2 should focus on users.
Another one here from Ether is Money. That is their handle. Do you think real-time Ethereum ZK proving will be available when Beamchain goes live into production by the end of the decade?
Yeah, 100%. I am extremely bullish on real-time proving. The latencies are just going down and down and down and down. And one of the things that I do want to highlight is basically there's this trick that you can do, which is that the proof comes, for the current slot, comes at the beginning of the next slot. So you have a whole slot to produce a proof, like a whole seconds, as opposed to having to compete to be the #1 fastest prover. So we're not talking about 100 millisecond real-time proving. We're talking about maybe 4-second real-time proving, which is much, much, much easier to deliver upon.
That's an argument to keep the slot time slow-ish, or at least 1 second and not 100 milliseconds, so that there is more time to produce that proof, and then we rely on pre-confirmations to make sure that we have fast finality, or fast pre-confirmations.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the nice thing with proving is that it's honest minority, meaning you just need one person in the world to go do it. But for the honest minority assumption to be plausible and credible, you need the hardware requirements to be relatively low. Now, I think the ideal would be that the only requirements to go build a proof is to have a powerful laptop. And there's like hundreds of millions of powerful laptops in the world, and like hopefully one of them is like helping Ethereum out with the proving. But if you need a data center and you only need one data center, well, that's not a very credibly neutral thing. And for the consensus layer, we can basically design it to be extremely snark friendly. Right, we can change everything internally and design it to be snark friendly. And in that context, a powerful laptop should definitely be enough. The problem, I guess, is for the EVM, which is not designed to be snark friendly. And so here you could imagine, delegating the building of the proofs to the builders that are more sophisticated. You could imagine ASICs playing a role, or you could imagine kind of losing the EVM and basically just embracing this RISC-V model. What will happen basically is that the really snark unfriendly opcodes in the EVM would have a much higher gas price because they would consume more RISC-V cycles. So it would be kind of this one-time relatively big change of the gas schedule, but it would make the native virtual machine of Ethereum priced properly for what we want to do, which is this snarkification.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the ASICs point. We have a question from Greg the Greek on how much more research is needed in verifiable delay functions, and are we opening up the door for VDF ASICs?
We already have VDF ASICs. There's already 2 VDF ASICs that have been manufactured. There's one from Chia, and the Ethereum Foundation also manufactured an ASIC in collaboration with Filecoin. So it's a small batch of test ASICs that we manufactured. There's only 100 of them. Actually, there's some in my hotel room that I'm giving away. And the production was successful in the sense that we have these VDF ASICs. They work. The thing that happened is that building and shipping hardware is extremely ambitious, and we put in a lot of effort to just get these 100 out. And there's even more effort to try and deliver them to the whole community, and it gets very expensive and time-consuming. And what happened is that VDFs, from my perspective, got deprioritized. And the reason is that Randall, which is the randomness beacon, didn't get attacked or is not being attacked. And there's just more important things to be working on. But yes, VDF is basically the one of the items in the roadmap. It was kind of the lowest priority in the cryptography section. And it's something that that is a no-brainer because it's just a pure technological upgrade that just improves Ethereum and gives us essentially perfect unbiasable randomness. Now, one of the things that I do want to highlight is that we now have in production the very first provably fair lottery that is using VDFs.
Nice.
So it's I think the website is eatthepie.xyz or eatthepie.eth.link. And they build this lottery which uses VDFs, and so you can just read the code and know that it's provably secure. And the reason why I'm excited about these provably secure lotteries is because they're basically unstoppable lotteries that are global. They're not limited to one single jurisdiction. They're provably fair, so there's no worries about the operator, maybe playing games. And also the cut is like 0 or absolutely tiny. So for example, in the case of Eat the Pie, there's a 1% cut, which is capped at, I think 100 ETH or something. I don't know exactly, but basically there's like a very, very small fee that is taken, which is in stark contrast to the government lotteries, where the average fee is something like 50%. And so my hope is that we can have, on a weekly basis, kind of the World Ethereum Lottery, where the prize is multiple billions of dollars, and it would be the largest lottery in the world.
I know in my state the lottery can get up to $400 million. So
nice.
So knowing that the government will take 50% of that is just, come
It's
on.
insane, yeah.
Come on. Another one from Bill S. Seems that there's some confusion about what this proposal will do to the other progress being made on the roadmap and other EIPs. What kind of progress might we expect on execution layer clients in this time frame, and fully snark L1 scaling ?
Yes. So the content of my talk was very zoomed in on the consensus layer, and I think it's important to zoom out and look at the other stuff that's happening. At the execution layer specifically, which is not my specialty, the EVM, there's like one thing that stands out, which is snarkifying the EVM. And as I mentioned, I think we're going to have that by the end of next year. Now, the next step after that is to make sure that we're comfortable as a community that we have enough client diversity within the ZK VM vendors, and that the performance is good enough to have real-time proving for sufficiently many of those vendors. And once we have that, then we can start adding the precompile. If I were to highlight another kind of big change to the EVM, which in some sense is a stepping stone to full snarkification, is the Verkle statelessness effort. So the idea here of Verkle is that instead of compressing everything, you only compress the state, right? So with snarks, you can drop the state and you can drop all of the complicated calculations. With Verkle, you drop the state, but you keep doing the computation. So basically, every transaction comes with the data that it's reading and writing to, along with proofs that this is indeed the correct data that is being read and written to. And then you just re-execute everything, but you only have to store the state root for the corresponding block. Now, one of the things that has happened in recent months, and we've had meetings here in Bangkok, is around this notion of pivoting Verkle to something potentially much more exciting, technically, which is this binary tree. And the reason why this pivot is potentially going to happen is because, there's two reasons. Reason number one is that Verkle, unfortunately, is not post-quantum secure, which means that if we go down the Verkle path, then it means that maybe in a few years down the line, we have to do another change of the state tree. And the other big reason is that in recent months even, we've seen a dramatic improvement of the performance of snarkifying hash functions. So in my talk, I highlighted basically one of the benchmarks from the Polygon folks, where on a MacBook Pro, an M3 MacBook Pro, they're able to prove 2 2 million hashes per second using just the one CPU, not even the GPU. And that is enough performance to have statelessness. So the basic idea is that you have a binary Merkle tree, which uses these snark-friendly hash functions, and then when you communicate the proof to a user, instead of sending the Merkle pass, which can be pretty big, you just compress all of the Merkle pass, which is just hash verification, into a single snark. And so now you can answer any stateless query with just one snark.
So it's a massive compression kind of technique that allows that effectively.
Yes, exactly. And in
just trying to wrap my head around this here.
Yes, it's basically like a compression technique, which is a stepping stone towards full snarkification, and it only has to deal with the state. And another kind of really cool thing is that if we were to move to this binary tree model, then the EVM would become like a lot more snark friendly, and so that would also tie in with synergies with the effort to snarkify it.
A spicy one is, why doesn't the execution layer get as much love?
Right. The problem with the execution layer is that we need forward compatibility. That is like the fundamental constraint. Like we can't just go break contracts. Now, one of the things that people complain about is, oh, the gas limit is too low, and the devs don't want to increase the gas limit. But the thing is that it's not to the devs. It's not the devs that control the gas limit. It's the validators, right? The way that it works is that every validator has a vote, and they can vote to increase the gas limit. And actually there's this website, is it like Pump the Gas or something, where they want to try and increase the gas limit maybe from 30 million gas to 40 million gas. And I'm all in favor for increasing the gas limit. And so, if you want higher gas, then just talk to the operators and increase the gas limit. It is not something that the devs are ultimately in control of. Now, one of the concerns that's been brought forward is that basically the amount of state would grow too fast. Now, I don't think this is an issue. The reason is that like state is relatively small today. It's on the order of 100 gigabytes, and the real issue is history growth. Okay, so history is basically the sum total of all of the blocks, and the state in some sense is like the condensation of all the history in the current state. Right, the present is much smaller than all of the past combined.
The historical state.
Yes, and what I think needs to happen urgently is that we just drop large parts of the history if you're running a validator client, right? Because ultimately consensus is about the present. Mm-hmm. Consensus is not about the past, and there's basically this social layer expectation somehow that history needs to be kept. There's a lot of work that has been done to try and get rid of history in a responsible way. I think it's like the 4.4s, EIP 4.4.4.4. And what I think would be like a practical way forward is basically to have the more powerful operators keep the full history, because at the end of the day it's just a couple of terabytes, or 1 terabyte. It's not that much. And then those that can't handle it basically prune the history and rely on things like BitTorrent or the Portal network, or even like centralized solutions like block explorers and whatnot that will be keeping a full copy of the history. And this is where the power of honest minority assumptions lie. What does honest minority mean? It means you just need one person in the world to have a copy of the history for the history to be available. And Ethereum is just so widespread and it provides so much value to so many different actors that there's going to be hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of copies, regardless of whether or not some few thousands of validators that are on their home computers have a copy.
Thanks, Justin. I think the last one here for you as we wrap up is the community wants to know how they can get involved and kind of what your call to action is for the community to help to support Beamchain, and how we can help to ship faster, ship better, and make sure that we execute on this well.
Right. So ultimately, like the proposal is like an accelerationist effort for the whole roadmap, not just for the consensus layer. So if you want to help accelerate Ethereum layer 1, then please contact me. I'm very easy to contact on Telegram or on Twitter. There's also a dedicated email address that was shared, beam.chain@ethereum.org. As I said, we've already received lots of emails there. And I think what's going to happen, in the coming months is that the dust is going to settle, and we're going to see like who are like the key builders that are committed to help accelerate this future, and like team formation will happen and whatnot. What happened historically with the beacon chain is that at the very beginning there was a lot of excitement, and there was 10 different teams that came in, and then there was a consolidation period, and now we're down to 5. And already we have 8 teams. So what I'm expecting to happen is that in the next few days we're going to have even more teams show up. And what I want to do is try and allocate resources, effectively, and try and make sure that we don't have a needlessly high amount of teams. And so I will be pointing, applicants to existing teams, and I will be kind of encouraging the new applicants to coalesce as much as possible.
Awesome, Justin. Thank you so much, and congratulations on the proposal. I know that it was a lot of work putting that together, and that the community can be quite critical at times, so props to putting yourself out there.
Yeah, and again, like, this is just a proposal, and the fact that we're receiving so much feedback is amazing, because it means that we can improve the proposal. So please keep giving the feedback, and yeah, the future is very bright.
Thank you.
Thank you.